basically halfway through a typical quarter. Quarter is generally 12 weeks. I told Rex that I don't know if I can finish Revelation in 12 weeks. It may take a week or two more than that, but he said that's going to be okay. So we'll make our best effort at it. But there's a lot of background material to be covered when you're studying a book like the book of Revelation. We're going to be starting out in chapter 8 this morning. We got just barely into chapter 8 last week, so if you want to open your Bibles, that's where we're going to be. We last week talked about the opening of the seven seals. It's one of the first things that you're going to see in the second vision. Now, we've already covered in class the first vision, and I've given these some names. I call the first vision Christ in the Church because he wrote a letter to these 7 different churches, 7 different congregations in Asia Minor, talking about how he was fully aware of some of the issues that they were dealing with. But then the second vision is Christ in the world, and this is the longest of the 4 visions. We are not quite halfway through that, but maybe by the end of the class this morning, we'll be about halfway through this second vision. We talked last week about the opening of the 7 seals. I think it's easier if I show you some of the pictures. Pictures sometimes speak 1,000 words. When the second vision opens up, we get a glimpse into God's throne room. You see a depiction here of God sitting in the center on his throne, surrounded by 24 thrones with 24 elders. This is a representation of all of God's people from the Old Covenant as well as the New Covenant. And then there's 4 unusual creatures that's talked about quite a bit. They call them 4 living creatures that have 3 sets of wings and eyes in the front and the back, and they represent, for the most part, all of God's creation. So you have an image here of God being in complete control of the world and the universe, of his creation. You've got all of his people there worshiping. You've got all of his creation there worshiping. And then what's not depicted right here, but is discussed in other scenes, is all of the angels in heaven also part of this worship, and a great multitude of believers that have gone beyond this life that are now in heaven according to the visions. So that was chapter 4. In chapter 5, they had an issue. They had a problem. God was holding in his right hand a scroll that had 7 seals on it, and there was no one found to be worthy to open the scroll, to open these 7 seals. I mean, it talks about how they searched in the heavenly realm, they searched all across the earth, they searched under the earth, they couldn't find anyone worthy until chapter 5, they found the Lamb. And the Lamb is a representation of Jesus Christ. This Lamb was standing, it was obviously alive, but it appeared to be slain. And so this is a representation of the resurrected Christ, who was worthy because he had overcome the being martyred here in this life. And he took the scroll from God's hand, and he proceeded to open the 7 seals. Now, as we were opening the 7 seals, the first 4 seals produced 4 horsemen. You'll remember there was a pale horseman rider that represents Christ, leading his armies into battle. Then the second seal was the red horseman rider, which represents war. And the way that I'm teaching the class, that's a war against the wicked Roman Empire. And then the black horse and rider represented famine, great famine that was going to come upon the enemies of God. And then the pale horse and rider, which represents death. And then Hades, for the evildoers, would follow that death. The 5th seal, he saw something completely different. He saw the souls of the martyrs that were underneath the altar in God's throne room, and these martyrs were crying out, O Lord, mighty and true, how long will you wait before you're going to bring justice against those who are still alive on this earth that have caused our death? And then the 6th seal that was opened showed a great cataclysm, earthquakes, stars falling from the heavens, and this represents, to my best knowledge, a cataclysm would be an upheaval in government against the Roman government. Then in chapter 7, there was an interlude that took place. God wanted to deal with the questions and the concerns that some of the faithful had. Are we going to be caught in the middle of this great upheaval between good and evil? And he wanted to make sure that their minds were calmed, they were eased, so he went through a process in the vision of sealing 144,000. This is a representative number of all the faithful that would be alive at the time of this great battle between good and evil. He wanted to place a mark, a symbolic mark on their forehead so that they would be spared from harm. The idea here is that there's going to be no friendly fire. God knows exactly who the faithful are, and they're not going to be harmed in any action that he would be taking. And there's a lot of people that do teach that there's only going to be 144,000 people in heaven, and that's not at all what the book of Revelation is trying to teach us, because in the very next verses, John is describing a multitude in heaven that he sees that is too numerous to count. I mean, it's a lot more than 144,000, but these are the souls that are already in heaven, that they don't need to be marked with this mark of God because they've already been saved. They've already received the blessing of being in God's presence in heaven. And it talks about them being led and being in the presence of the Lamb, of Christ. So a lot of things happening in those first 6 openings of the 6 seals, and then the 7th seal kind of links directly into the sounding of the 7 trumpets, because when the 7th final seal was opened, John was able to see 7 angels, and these 7 angels were each given a trumpet, and so this proceeds right into where we are today. We're going to be starting in chapter 8 talking about the trumpet blasts. And in typical Revelation fashion, we're not going to get all 7 of them at one time. There's going to be another interlude before we get to the 7th trumpet. And we should get there today. It's going to be in chapter 10 and 11. We'll certainly get to chapter 10 today. But before we start talking about the trumpets, I want to warn you, I want to advise you that with the opening of the first 4 trumpets, they're going to be accompanied by some pretty frightening scenes. And I'm telling you this in advance because I don't want you to be scared when you hear these read. These scenes are events that are, it's going to describe the symbolic destruction of the entire world, the earth, and a good portion of the universe are going to be described, the destruction in these first 4 trumpets that will be sounded. But this terrifying depiction is only meant to remind the readers of God's awesome and unstoppable power. The fearsome imagery suggests that even an empire as powerful as Rome is no match for the powers of God, because God can wipe out the entire earth and the universe at will if he chooses to do so. The earth and the heaven are God's. They're part of his creation. He gave his creation. He can take his creation if he chooses to do so. God literally holds the fate of the heavens and the earth in his hands, would be another way to kind of think about these first 4 trumpets. Now, these are going to come fairly quickly, so let's try to follow along. We're going to start in verse 6 of chapter 8, and this is the opening of, or the sounding rather, of the first trumpet. And the trumpets are warnings. Just to make a distinction, the seals were revealing God's judgment. Now the trumpets are warning about God's judgment. So there's a distinction. They're not exactly the same thing. They're a little bit different. So the first warning, verse 6. And the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound them. The first sounded, and there was hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled to the earth, and 1/3 of the earth was burned up, and 1/3 of the trees were burned up, and all of the green grass was burned up. So this first trumpet, this first warning, it's warning the readers that God has the power to dramatically destroy 1/3 of the earth using hail and fire. All right, moving on, the second trumpet. The second angel sounded, and something like a great mountain burning with fire was hurled into the sea. And 1/3 of the sea became blood, and 1/3 of the creatures who were in the sea who had life died, and 1/3 of the ships were destroyed. So much like the first trumpet, now we have the second trumpet. This warning is foretelling that God has the ability to destroy 1/3 of the earth with a great, what I would describe as a volcanic-like eruption. So he can use hail and fire, he can use a volcanic eruption, and he can destroy significant portions of the earth at will when he chooses to do so. And again, this is only a vision. You look around you, the earth is not destroyed. We are still here, we're still breathing, we're still alive on the earth. But this is a vision. I'll explain more about that in a moment. Let's look at the third trumpet. This is in verse 10. The third trumpet sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on 1/3 of the rivers and on the springs of waters. And the star is named Wormwood. I think it's unusual that named a star in this case, but the star is named wormwood, and a third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the waters because they were made bitter. So we've had 3 trumpets now, and the third trumpet, this warning signals the destruction of the remaining 1/3 of the earth by a great falling star. Now, it would have been well known to the readers in the first century what wormwood was. I don't think so much about wormwood, but this was a very, very bitter herb. They would have been familiar with wormwood. So to name a star wormwood would have brought to their minds bitterness, pain, and suffering. And this is the kind of thing that if it was in the waterways, it would pollute the waterways and possibly even make them poisonous. Now, I want you to notice that within the context of these 3 visions, the earth is now completely destroyed 1/3 at a time, with the first trumpet, the second trumpet, and the third trumpet. This would mean that all life that exists on the earth, at least in the context of this vision, is now destroyed. Everyone is dead that would be living on the earth. But awareness somehow continues even beyond that death, because the warnings don't stop, they continue. But in the context of this vision, all life on earth is now gone, can't sustain life any longer. Now the fourth trumpet also yields something quite dramatic. It says, the fourth angel sounded, and a third of the sun, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars were struck, so that a third of them would be darkened. And the day would not shine for a third of it, and the night in the same way. So now it's affecting the universe. The fourth warning signals the destruction of 1/3 of the universe, the sun, the moon, and the stars, so that there is now darkness once again, just like there was before creation. For all intents and purposes, all of God's creation is done, at least in the context of this vision. The idea being conveyed is that the God who gave it all can just as easily take it all. That's the message, I believe, that is intended with this particular section. But the warnings are not over. All right, God's going to give a little rest right now from the trumpets with this revelation. Verse 13 is going to reveal something different to us. It says, well, before I go on to that, let me just kind of explain something here. The first 4 trumpets, I kind of interpret the first 4 trumpets like being God's shot across the bow to get the attention of enemy combatants, to warn them of his awesome power. And the idea, as I mentioned earlier, is that really Rome is no match for the power of God. Now that God has warned them about his overwhelming and unstoppable power, he will describe the type of punishment that he intends to bring against them, the evildoers, those who are following Domitian, those that are following Satan. Those who are persecuting Christians are on notice. Following Satan and resisting God is a no-win scenario. That's in my take on those first 4 trumpets, is a warning specifically to those evildoers that you're dealing with something that you've never dealt with before, with the power that God has. Now, let's see what we can digest here from verse 13. John says, Then I looked, and I heard an eagle flying in mid-heaven, saying with a loud voice, Woe, woe, woe to those who live on the earth, because of the remaining blasts of the trumpet of the 3 angels who are about to sound. So, as I told you, these first 4 trumpets were like God's shot across the bow, telling God's judgment will continue. But when you and I read trumpets, to us it sounds like it's out of order, because in the first 4 trumpets, the earth and the observable universe has been destroyed. And then with the last 3 warnings, the last 3 trumpets, he's going to be destroying the Roman Empire. I mean, doesn't that seem backwards to you? It does to me. In my literal way of thinking, wouldn't you destroy the earthly target before you destroy the earth? I mean, after you've destroyed the entire earth, is there even a Roman Empire left to destroy? But that's just the way you and I think. But we have to have faith in God that he knows what he's doing with this warning. We have to remember that this is a symbolic description. This is not an actual series of events. God knows what he's doing. Trumpets 1, 2, 3, and 4 broadcast God's supreme authority over his creation. And as I said before, he can do with the earth and the universe as he wills. Think of it as saber rattling. You know, you've heard that term used before, to strike fear into your enemies. I think that's what's going on here. Then the next trumpets, 5, 6, and 7, will announce God's fearsome anger being focused on one target, an earthly target, on the Roman Empire. Now let's talk about this eagle that's flying through the mid-heaven in verse 13. He's sounding a warning. If trumpet blasts were not warning enough, now the threat level is elevated. It's intensified with the sounding of these three woes coming from this eagle flying through the mid-heavens. The idea is that bad things are coming. Things like misery, grief, distress, anguish, despair, times 3 is coming because there's 3 woes. In other words, the worst is yet to come. Now, I want to dissect one statement in here for you. What the eagle said was, woe, woe, woe to those who live on the earth. You've got to understand Revelation terminology. Every time Revelation says those who live on the earth is talking about wicked people, evildoers, followers of Satan. It's not talking about Christians that are alive on the earth. So when this eagle says, woe, woe, woe to those who live on the earth, this is a warning for evildoers. And you'll see this term used other places in Revelation. I just want you to remember, every time it says those who live on the earth, John's talking about wicked people, evildoers. The final 3 trumpets, 5, 6, and 7, will carry further significance because they are accompanied by 3 woes. And these woes are going to come against the tormentors of God's people, the Roman Empire. The warnings are getting louder, more ominous, because the Lord knows that Satan has a tight grip on the nations. He has a tight grip on the Roman Empire, and it's going to take a dramatic solution to loosen that grip. Christ wants as many of the followers of Satan to repent of their sinful ways before it becomes too late. Once the judgment is unleashed, at that point it will be too late. So these warnings they're dire. There's a lot at stake here. God and Christ, they don't want the evildoers to miss these warnings, but sadly we're going to see as we move on in the text that most of them do not heed the warnings. All right, now we're going to start chapter 9. We have the 5th trumpet starting right here in verse 1. Let's go ahead and read this one and talk about it. The 5th angel sounded, and I saw a star from heaven. I've lost track of how many stars John has seen fall in these visions, but there's been a lot of them. But he saw a star from heaven, which had fallen to the earth, and after the abyss was given to him, he opened the shaft of the abyss, and smoke ascended out of the shaft like the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened from the smoke of the shaft. So John sees another star falling to heaven, and this key is given to this angel that had sounded the 6th trumpet, and it's a key to the shaft of the abyss. Now, your text might call this the bottomless pit. It's talking about the same thing. And the angel used the key to open the shaft of the abyss. Now, what is the shaft of the abyss? What is this bottomless pit? This is a symbolic place of confinement for evil forces, is the way that Revelation is using this terminology. And then it says in verse 2 that smoke, as you can see on screen, smoke billowed out of the abyss like a furnace. So John's being very descriptive here of what's happening. Now he tells us quite a bit more about this 5th trumpet sounding in the shaft of the abyss. In verse 3 he says, "Then out of the smoke came locusts upon the earth, and power was given to them as the scorpions of the earth have power. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth, nor any green thing, nor any tree, but only the people who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads." Let me pause right there. You'll remember last week I explained during this interlude that there was a symbolic mark placed on the foreheads of all of God's people. So those that do not have the mark are the enemies of God. They're the enemies of the church. So let's continue now with verse 5. "And they," being the locusts, they were not permitted to kill anyone but to torment for 5 months. And their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings a person. And in those days, I think this part's really interesting, and in those days people will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, and death will flee from them. What a dramatic image that creates. So it is revealed that the plague of locust-like creatures will be unleashed from this shaft of the abyss, and they'll torment people on earth for a brief period of time. And remember, this is not literal, but it says 5 months. And unlike normal locusts, these locusts are not permitted to harm any vegetation. They're not eating crops. They're not eating tree leaves. They're not eating any vegetation. Only people who do not have the mark of God on their forehead. That's who they are there to sting and to work on. That's according to verse 4. These creatures, let's see if I can give you a little bit more of a picture to look at. These creatures coming out of the shaft of the abyss will afflict terrible pain, but not death, according to verse 5. The suffering will be so intense that people will wish for death, but they will be denied the relief of death. And it's human instinct, when you think about it, we try to avoid death all the time. But in this case with these people, death is avoiding them. That seems kind of backwards as well. According to verse 6, it says, death will flee from them. So we see these creatures, these locust-like creatures. They're not locusts, but they're locust-like creatures coming out of the shaft of the abyss. Now, fortunately, John does provide us more of a graphic description of these creatures so that we can get a little bit better idea of what they looked like in this vision to John. Verse 7, it says, the appearance of the locusts was like horses prepared for battle. All right, time out again. I want to pause here. Be noticing how many times the text refers to horses and to horsemen. The next few readings we're going to see some more, but just think back. Last week, the opening of the first 4 seals, what appeared from those first 4 seals? 4 horsemen. A white horse, a red horse, a black horse, a pale horse. Now, John is saying here with this 5th seal that these locusts, they appear like war horses. They appear like horses being prepared for battle. And let's continue on. He's talking about these locusts that appear like horses. He says, on their heads appear to be crowns like gold, and their faces were like human faces. And they had hair like the hair of women, and their teeth were like the teeth of lions. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the sound of chariots, like many horses, there's our word again, like many horses rushing to battle. Then they had tails like scorpions and stings, and in their tails is the power to hurt people for 5 months. And they have as king over them the angel of the abyss. His name in the Hebrew is Abaddon, and in the Greek he had the name Apollyon. The first woe has passed. Behold, 2 are still coming after these things. So he does give us more of a description. This is a frightening picture right here, but this is an artist's rendering of what these locust-like creatures look like according to the description that John gave us. Notice the body is more like a horse, but it has wings, it can fly. It has a human-like face. It's got long hair like a woman might wear, and it's got sharp fangs, teeth like a lion would have. So a very fearsome creature being described here. So in this verse, verses 1 through 11, we've read all of these. This fifth trumpet is warning of the opening of the bottomless pit. It will release a plague-like locust that will torment those who do not have the mark of God on their foreheads, who do not have God's ownership marked on them. And notice that the locusts here are described like horses. We're going to come back to that in just a moment. Now, the image of a swarm of locusts that resembled horses with teeth like lions specifically, and the suffering that they bring should sound familiar to you because it is eerily familiar. It's eerily similar to a description that was given in the Old Testament. Joel was describing a vision in chapters 1 and 2, and he described these same creatures. I mean, almost to a T, they were being described in the Old Testament. So we've seen in the scriptures these creatures being described before. once in Joel, now in Revelation. I also think it's interesting that the text in verse 11 gives us the name of the king that they had over them was this angel from the abyss, and it gave two names, a Hebrew name of Abaddon and a Greek name of Apollyon. Both the Greek name and the Hebrew name, they both mean exactly the same thing. They mean destroyer. So they are being led by the destroyer. So just take that for what it's worth. That is the king that these locust-like creatures had over them. The warnings of misery and despair are growing more urgent. So that was the fifth trumpet. Now the text moves right into the sixth trumpet in verse 13. Then the sixth angel sounded, and I heard the voice of from the four horns of the golden altar which is before God, saying to the sixth angel who had the trumpet, and this is what the voice said, release the four angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates. And then in verse 15 it says, and the four angels who had been prepared for the hour and day and month and year were released so that they would kill a third of mankind. And an interesting footnote here, verse 16, John notes, the number of the armies of the horsemen, there's our word again, was 200 million. And he said, I heard the number of them. So we've got the sixth trumpet being opened now, and another image appears. You have these four very powerful, destructive angels who have been prepared for this moment in time, being released, not just from anywhere. He's very specific here. They're being released from the Euphrates River to the east. So this represents the second woe to come against the Roman Empire. And forewarning in this image is given to the slaying of 1/3 of mankind. And once again, this is a vision that's being described here. I explained to you a couple weeks ago, visions are an awful lot like parables. You don't take them literally. That's the wrong way to interpret a vision. And it's the wrong way to interpret a parable, is trying to get a larger message across with the things that are being described here. But the forewarning is given of the slaying of 1/3 of mankind by an army of horsemen of unimaginable numbers, 200 million, if you can get your mind wrapped around that. Four unleashed angels swiftly descend on Rome like an army of horsemen, according to the text for this sixth trumpet. And because they had been prepared for, and it says the hour, the day, the month, the year in verse 15, this gives us the idea that they were released at a specific time, at a specific moment, and not a moment earlier. This was the time that they had been prepared for. In other words, God has a plan, and he's executing his plan. The number 200 million in verse 16 is a symbolic number, I believe, of the overwhelmingly unstoppable force of God, of his judgment. And I would interpret it that way rather than as a literal number of horsemen in an army. This is a warning of God's judgment to be brought on the Roman Empire for their rebellion against God. And it does continue now with verse 17. And this is how I saw in my vision the horses and those who sat on them. The riders had breastplates, the color of fire, of hyacinth, and of brimstone. And the heads of the horses were like heads of lions, and out of their mouths came fire and smoke and brimstone. And 1/3 of mankind was killed by these three plagues, by the fire, the smoke, and the brimstone, which came out of their mouths. For the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents and have heads, and with them they do harm. So just like with the fifth trumpet, he saves his more vivid description till the very end. And this time he's giving us a description of what these attacking forces really looked like. And this is an artist rendering, obviously, of this one of these horsemen riding a horse that has a lion's head. The lions had fire and smoke and brimstone coming out of their mouths. That was their main destructive force. But they did a lot of damage with their serpent-like tails that had heads on the tails. So he does give us a better description here of the advancing forces. The riders were equipped with breastplates, and the breastplates were like fire. The horses had lions' heads, they had tails of serpents. Smoke, fire, and brimstone did most of the damage, and a third of mankind was killed by what it describes as this plague of smoke, fire, and brimstone. This must have been a fearsome sight for poor old Apostle John to see. If you put yourself in his shoes, all the terrible, terrible things that he's seen so far. And they're only going to get worse, folks. As we move into the bowls of wrath, these warnings, the unleashing of God's judgment is only going to get worse. These images are going to get worse for John. I really feel for John when I read the book of Revelation. I can't imagine how I would have felt seeing all these terrible things that were going on. But I do believe that the sixth trumpet is a specific warning against the defeat of the Roman army. And I'm going to explain why I believe that here in just a moment. Let's go ahead and finish out the chapter here. Just a couple more verses. Verse 20. All right, so a third of mankind in this vision was killed by the fire, smoke, and brimstone. Now he's talking about those that weren't killed. Now listen to what he says. The rest of mankind who were not killed by the plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, so as not to worship demons and the idols of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk. And they did not repent of their murders, nor of their witchcraft, nor of their sexual immorality, nor of their thefts. This passage, we may come back to this when we get into chapter 11, I think is part of the reason why God feels compelled to send his two witnesses that we will read about in chapter 11. Because so many of these wicked evildoers are just recalcitrant. They are not willing to repent. They are not going to turn from their ways. They're still going to worship their idols, even though you've got the living God, and they're still worshiping idols, what does it say here, of gold, silver, brass, stone, and wood that can neither see nor hear nor walk. I mean, they're not alive, and they're still going to worship those idols, even in the face of all the miraculous things that they're going to see from God. But notice, it's interesting to me that this text points out that the subject of their worship was demons. Notice it says that in verse 20, demons. So these are Satan worshipers. These are followers of Satan who are guilty of all manner of transgressions and sins. And it talks about idol worship, murder, witchcraft, sexual immorality, theft. I mean, these are some pretty major sins that they are guilty of, and they're not willing to repent of any of those sins. And folks, when we get further in the text, you're going to see that they will be held accountable for that decision. But they've been given the opportunity to make the right decision. They are being warned right here. That's the whole purpose of these 7 trumpets, is to provide warning for these evildoers. Now, I want to come back to this subject of horses and horsemen. I had you thinking about this before. And we had 4 horsemen that appeared after the first 4 seals in chapter 6. And then in chapter 9, we saw a couple of other occurrences of horses. The 5th trumpet, there was locust-like creatures that had the appearance of horses. And then with the 6th trumpet, we had the appearance of an overwhelming army of horsemen that were unusual horses. They had the heads of lions, and they were coming out of the east. Now, I believe, and not everyone's going to agree with me on this, but I believe that the frequent reference to horses and horsemen in the book of Revelation may very well represent the nations that ultimately destroyed the Roman Empire and the physical means by which they would do it. The Roman army was the most powerful army on the face of the earth during this point in time, but they had a weakness. The Roman army, they were foot soldiers, and history records that they met their demise against armies that rode into battle on horses. The Roman army was never able to strategically overcome this military advantage. Here's an artist's rendering of the Parthian nation, their war horses, their army. Though Rome tried to defeat the Parthian nation, and you think about Rome conquering everything, the known world, that's not all necessarily true. There were a few nations that they tried repeatedly to conquer, but they never conquered. The Parthian nation in particular, they tried for 300 years, almost 300 years, to conquer the Parthian nation, and they were never successful. From 52 BC to 217 AD, the Parthians were able to repel the attacking forces of the Roman army because the Parthian nation were horsemen. It didn't take very long for other nations to learn about the Parthians' success in repelling the Roman Empire, the Roman army, and soon other nations were training their soldiers to ride horses and to be horsemen in battle. And ultimately, the enemies of Rome destroyed the entire Roman Empire, including the Roman army, and conquered the city of Rome in 396 AD. So their demise came about by horses. Now, it may just be a coincidence that I'm reading into the text of Revelation, but there's just too many references to horses for me to think it's just a coincidence. I think it is tied into the demise of the Roman army. So here at the end of chapter 9, let's go ahead and decode a little bit from chapter 8 and chapter 9 about the opening of these trumpets and what they might represent. The first trumpet represented the destruction by hail and fire of 1/3 of the earth. The second trumpet, we saw the destruction of another third of the earth, this time by some kind of volcanic-like eruption in the sea. The third trumpet, we saw another third of the earth, so if you're keeping track, this is all of the earth now, destroyed by a great falling star that had the unusual name of wormwood. And then the fourth trumpet, we saw a third of the universe being destroyed. And together, when you add all four of these trumpets and these warnings, you see that all of God's created world is now no more. For all intents and purposes, it has been destroyed. And it shows us and the readers that God has the power to destroy all things if he chooses to do so. This is a demonstration of God's invincible power. And if he has the power over heaven and earth, then he certainly has the power to destroy the Roman Empire. Then after a brief interlude, again, he saw the eagle flying in the mid-heavens. Then the trumpets continued to be sounded. The fifth trumpet, we saw the shaft of the abyss being opened by the key that opened the bottomless pit. And this represents the first woe, the first warning of woe, specifically against Rome. And then with the sixth trumpet, we saw the army from the east that emerged. And this is the second woe to come against Rome. And I do personally believe that this represents the destruction of the Roman army. And as I told you earlier, we will have to be patient and wait until chapter 11 before we see the seventh trumpet. Now, we've got 5 minutes, so I would like for us to go ahead and jump right into chapter 10. We won't finish this today. But something different is happening now. I see chapter 10 and chapter 11 very similar to chapter 7. It's kind of a pause in the action. We're going to have to wait until some things transpire here in chapters 10 and 11 before John is allowed to see what happens when the seventh trumpet sounds. In particular, what we're going to see in chapter 10, I'm convinced, is a preparation scene. It's preparing John for the dramatic scenes that he will be asked to prophesy with the rest of this vision. He's prophesied so many things already with the first vision and the first part of the second vision, but he's going to be asked to prophesy some even scarier things, some more frightening things later on. And John needs to be prepared, and I think God knows that. So let's see what we cover in this reading. Starting in verse 1, John speaking, I saw another strong angel coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and the rainbow was on his head, and his face was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire. And he had in his hand a little scroll which was open. He placed his right foot on the sea and his left on the land, and he cried out with a loud voice, as when a lion roars. And when he cried out, the 7 peals of thunder uttered their voices. When the 7 peals of thunder had spoken, I was about to write, and I heard a voice from heaven saying, seal up these things which the 7 peals of thunder have spoken, and do not write them. So a lot of intrigue, very mysterious. A lot of ways, chapter 10 leaves us with a lot more questions than answers. But let's see what we can get out of this. By this point in time, the Apostle John has witnessed the opening of the 7 seals, and the 6 trumpets have sounded already, and I'm sure he's completely overwhelmed by all that he has seen at this point in time. But in chapter 10, he's going to be given more instructions to prepare him for some of the overwhelming things that he will see with the rest of this prophetic vision. In verses 1 through 4, John saw another mighty angel, and this is a powerful heavenly messenger who is prepared to reveal something of significance. He has this open scroll, this book in his hand. So he's ready to reveal what the contents are. This angel holds an open scroll, and we're not allowed to hear what it has to say. When the angel cried out, John also heard the voice of 7 peals of thunder. So 7 thunders spoke. And this is some sort of mysterious voice, these voices of divine authority. And the suspicious part here is just as John was about to write down what he heard, another voice from heaven told him not to write what he had heard. So unlike the 7 seals, unlike the 7 trumpets, unlike the 7 bowls of wrath, these 7 thunders were not allowed to know what was revealed. So this is telling me that not all prophecy is disclosed. Some parts of God's plan remains hidden until a more appropriate time. And on that note, we will have to wait for a more appropriate time to continue with our lesson. So we'll start with verse 5 next week. And if you're reading ahead, spend a little bit of extra time in chapter 11. There's been a lot of controversy over who these 2 witnesses are. I'm going to tell you right now, I don't have the answer. I've got my suspicion, but it's no better than anyone else's suspicion. But read chapter 11 very carefully. But we should get into hopefully chapter 11 and possibly into 12 and start being introduced to the Hadean realm in chapter 12. Thank you once again for your attention, and as normal, I hope that this has been beneficial to you.